Thank you very much. I would like to thank the cluster and especially Claudia for giving me the opportunity to be here, spend a couple of weeks here in Constance. And so I'm going to present a project today that is a new one, so it's not published. And it's with a series of co-authors, some sociologists, some political scientists. And the good thing about this talk is I don't need to introduce why this is an important topic. Everybody is aware of the relevance of the recent surge of right-wing, radical right politics all across the world. So let me just jump into it then without a kind of a framing introduction. And for this project, we look at 4 political attitudes or discourses that define radical right politics as opposed to, for example, standard conservative politics of the past. One is populism, the distrust of political elites, and the promise to bring back power to the people, the undifferentiated people that stand in opposition to the elites that have sold out the interests of the people to global interests or to immigrant and other minority interests. The second element is ethnic nationalism, so an emphasis on ancestry and on nativity, being born in the country, as elements that define true members of the nation. So a restrictive ancestry nativity-based understanding of who really belongs and whose interests count or should count in policymaking. The third element is authoritarianism, the idea that a strong leader is needed to bring the country back on a virtuous path. And even if these leaders are sometimes violating established principles of liberal of liberal democracy. And finally, chauvinism, the idea that one's own country is morally superior to all other countries in the world. It's the best country in the world. So these are the 4 elements, and in the literature, the first 3 are kind of standard to group them together as radical right attitudes. The 4th is less common. We do it here because also we have, we designed the survey that I will talk about in a second to include a broad understanding of radical right politics. It's a vast research field. Obviously, there's a lot on the supply side if you want to use this language of radical right politics, so an emphasis on political leaders and what they do, their rhetorics and so on, emphasis on parties and platforms. Now radical right policies diffuse across the party spectrum. So a lot of, with NLP techniques and so on, studies of discourse, speeches, the role of the media is often highlighted. And then there's an equal amount, obviously, on the demand side for radical right politics as it manifests itself in such things as voting, so voting behavior, attitudes, attitudinal research, and so on and so on. And we focus here exclusively on the demand side, so we will leave everything out that has to do with politicians, parties, and so on, personalities, charismatic leaders, and all the rest. And that's, in my reading of the literature, there is 4 different approaches, main approaches to the demand side. One is highlights the economic interests of especially the working classes or the lower middle classes sometimes, whose interests are threatened by globalization, offshoring and so on, by rising immigration and competition from immigrants. Then there is cultural backlash theories, where the argument is that rapid social change overwhelms especially the less educated and the older people, and the backlash then takes the form of, among other things, support for radical right parties and movements that promise to bring back the good old times, as it were. Usually that's the 1950s and 60s. Then there is a large literature on status threat that the argument here is that the political empowerment of minorities over the last decades in liberal democratic regime threatens the status privileges of the non-immigrant, native, white, and so on majorities, and that radical right politics is basically a response to that. And then finally, there's the argument that a more general argument that there's a crisis in liberal democratic representation. There's distrust in political institutions and the principles of representation in liberal democracies that also feeds into the rise of radical right parties. So we are in this paper, we're trying to add a new piece to the mosaic, as it were. So we don't want to replace these other explanations, but we add something new, and that's a milieu-focused explanation of support for radical right views and radical right parties. So we focus on social cultural milieus, or Lebenswelten in German, that are conducive to radical right attitudes. And we look at the multi-generational constitution of these milieus. So we have a kind of a longer term perspective than most research on radical right attitudes. And we look at milieus that cut across the rural-urban divide that you can find in rural places and you can find them in cities, and cuts across social class divides as well. So milieus that you can find in the working classes and among the educated elite as well. The argument, in a nutshell, is that deep multi-generational geographic roots in a particular place, or family rootedness for short. Individuals with such deep roots are more prone to develop radical right attitudes. And this represents, hence the title of the talk and the paper, the shadow side of rootedness, while in most sociology and political science, stability, residential stability, is usually seen as something positive. For example, in the neighborhoods effects literature, that's a very strong kind of tendency. And so I think that our approach is also different in its general theoretical thrust. So most of the literature has kind of grievance arguments, economic grievances, status grievances, and so on and so on. And we argue that, while we're not arguing against this, but we are more interested in a plausibility mechanism. So try to find out in which milieus do radical right descriptions of the world appear as morally plausible and empirically plausible as well. And just to clarify this from the start, so we're really focusing on this demand side. So we're looking at how the pool, if you want to use this metaphor, of radical right voters is filled. We're not focusing on when actually this potential is mobilized, when these voters are mobilized, when all of this translates into radical right party support in specific historical and political configurations. So, but why should intergenerational geographic stability foster radical right attitudes? So here's the theory and the mechanisms and so on that link the two. So the argument starts with intergenerational geographic stability. And then we argue that there are 4 characteristics of the social milieus that are linked to that follow from that. And these are mostly, as you will see, network characteristics. So our argument has a networky kind of way of understanding and defining social milieus. So if people live in the same place that their parents have lived or even their grandparents have lived, so if you have these intergenerational geographic stability, the networks will contain many family members, obviously, because you keep in touch with the people who are close by, and many lifelong friends, people who also have grown up in the same milieu, also experience residential stability over generations, and so on. Second, these networks are more territorially confined, so they are less far-reaching because people have basically stayed in the place where they are. And as some other research has shown, they're more densely clustered, meaning you have more, if you like network jargon, they have more triadic closures. So friends of friends are also friends with each other. So you have many more kind of densely woven cliques in such milieus. And third, individuals are exposed to the authority of their parents and grandparents if they are still around. So the grandparents and the parents, they interfere in how you raise your children, on whether you should do this or that, and so on. To have exposure to familial authority that you wouldn't have if you live in a place where your grandparents and parents are far away from. And finally, individuals in such milieus develop a localist perspective that kind of follows from the previous, meaning their social horizon is restricted to these milieux where their family and lifelong friends and so on live, and they tend to develop local pride as well, which so pride in the place where they live, which is reinforced by the pride of others in their networks who also grew up in this place. So reinforcing this kind of localist and local pride kind of outlook on the social world. Please feel, I don't know what the rules of the game are here, but please. You ask in the end? Okay. Then these milieu characteristics, according to our theory, are then projected on the national level, meaning they are taken to be features of the nation as a whole, of the entire country. And the way that this works is through a variety of mostly psychological mechanisms that are well known from the literature in social psychology, and they're overlapping. Let's see whether I can do this. Yeah, they're overlapping. So in-group projecting is I think her name is Mumendai, and she's a social psychologist here from Germany. She has worked on this. So in-group projection means that the characteristics of your own group, subgroup, are taken as characteristics for the entire population. Social sampling comes from a different literature, more technical literature in sociology. Is very similar, basically taking, you think that the characteristics of your own social environment are average, are typical for the country as a whole, and then there's a similar mechanism from the nationalism literature, which basically argues that the nation is perceived through the lens of the local society that people inhabit. And so how do these these three mechanisms translate these four characteristics into right-wing political attitude? So let's start with the top. So if your network is composed of lots of family members, then the idea that the nation also should be defined by ancestral ties becomes more plausible. If you're many lifelong friends that also grew up in this milieu, were born in the same kind of environment, characterize your network, you think that nativity, being born in the country, should be a valid criteria for defining who belongs and who doesn't belong to the country. These territorially confined and highly clustered, highly cliquish milieus lend themselves to a populist political worldview where the division between uprooted elites and the rooted people that stand together in solidarity, know each other, and so on, are characteristics. And the lifelong exposure to the authority of parents and grandparents, which across the universe are considered to be very legitimate forms of authority, maybe with the exception of Western teenagers in recent cohorts, but outside of your own milieus and your children, parental and grandparental authority is quite universally accepted as a legitimate form of authority. And that lends itself then to support of an authoritarian worldview where strong leadership is needed and where established social hierarchies, such as between generations, need to be defended. And finally, the local pride and the localist orientation that people have who grow up in these rooted milieus lends itself to chauvinist understandings of the role of their country in the world. So what are these color codings here? So in the main survey that I'm going to show you results from, we sadly only have these red data, and but I did an additional analysis with GSS data where we have these blue data as well, so we can show that some of these intervening mechanisms are indeed at work. The hypotheses that come from that is really straightforward and very simple, almost embarrassingly simple. First, the larger the number of ancestors born in the current place where our respondents live, the more he or she should hold on to radical right attitudes, to all four of these. And this, perhaps a little bit less trivial, this effect should be intergenerationally additive, meaning it's not just dependent on parents or grandparents. So the number of parents and number of grandparents born in the current locale of respondents should have independent effects on each other. According to the theory, this is a little bit more interesting, and also for a lot of people that I talk to about this project, a little bit confusing. So I'm trying to be as clear as possible. According to the theory, the mechanism should work across geographic communities and across class positions. None in what I showed you in this theory slide with this, none of this is specified in a way that you would think that these mechanisms should work more for highly educated or less educated, or for rural people or for urban people. So rootedness, in other words, should generate right-wing orientations in both rural and urban environments, and the same for social class in highly educated, among highly educated and economically affluent milieus, as well as among less educated and less affluent people. Our argument, therefore, contrasts with some of the ethnographic work on radical right support that has been done in the US, in France, but there must be ethnographies also of the AfD and so on in Eastern Germany that I'm not aware of. And a lot of this, actually all of this ethnographic work points at rural working class milieus as specifically as the place where radical right attitudes flourish the most. So our argument contrasts with this interpretation of milieu effects. So our idea about milieu is not place specific. It is basically, these milieus can be found in New York City. They can be found in, now I've got all the names that I biked through the last couple of weeks. Stein am Rhein. Or what's on the other side of the lake? Meersburg, and so on and so on, and in Berlin as well. And so obviously, the more kind of hardcore research-oriented people in this room will already think about that in advance, I'm sure. So we will have to do with reverse causation issues, that people might select into rooted milieus. They might move to where all their parents and grandparents are based on the political attitudes they have formed independently of this milieu. And we will have to look at confounders. We'll have to look at things that might influence both the probability of staying in the place where your family lives and that also generate at the same time a propensity to support radical right worldviews. So let me talk about the data. So it's a survey that we run in 22 countries. It was sponsored by the Tokyo Foundation for once. I highly recommend the Tokyo Foundation as long as you don't have to deal with their admin and their accountants and so on. They're extraordinarily strict, I think, even by German standards. And this is the list of countries. So it's across the West, but then we also have Argentina, we have Brazil, we have India, Japan, Korea, Peru, Philippines, and so on. So the selection criteria is that we wanted to have countries that are democratic or semi-democratic, so where there's election and parties and so on, and where you have at least some radical right parties in these kind of countries. So that's why it doesn't make sense to do this research in a place like China, where people would be very hesitant to even answer these kinds of surveys. These are nationally representative. We have 32,000 respondents who passed some kind of attention checks. And we ask, that's the crucial independent variable, how many of your parents and grandparents were born in the town or city where you currently live? We would love to have much more data about this, like how many were in the place that you lived before, how many, and so on and so on. Ideally, we would have a complete residential history of everybody and complete information on how many ancestors lived in which of these places where people have ever lived, but that's not how we did it. And that obviously ranges from 0 to 6. And we measure radical right attitudes with 4, or maybe I can say something about the distribution of this core independent variable here. So about 50% of our respondents globally live in places with 0 ancestors, so most people are not rooted. And, but then the second largest group is about 10% in the global sample that are people who live where all 6 of their ancestors were born. And there's a lot of variation between countries. The most rooted country, as it were, is maybe surprising, maybe not, is Italy. And we're about 40%, 30% of the population lives in places where all 6 ancestors were born as well. And the most unrooted, by these standards, country is France. Oh. Yeah. Okay, so we also have an additional supplementary analysis I'm going to show you, which is about party support. So we have a question, which party you feel closest to? And then I went through the party lists. That we had all the parties that were competing in the last elections, and I went to kind of standard lists of radical right parties that exist and try to reconciliate where there were differences and so on. So we identified radical right parties, and in this analysis, it's obviously a binary. People feel closest, yes or no, to a radical right party. So here are the main results. With attitudes now first as the outcomes, and we have control variables. We use country fixed effects to control for history, party systems, recent success of right-wing parties, and other kinds of country-level features. And we have a range of individual level variables that control for other theories, the other main theories of radical right support that I mentioned. We're going to not go through that in detail. So we have economic threat variables, cultural backlash, status threat variables. And this is, look at this PowerPoint effect that I did specially for you. I'm going to do it again because the results are kind of not very exciting, right? So you know that it's going to work statistically. So these are the results for these 4 different outcomes, attitudinal outcomes. And the outcome scale is, yes, let's look at the effect sizes here. And if you use betas, standardized coefficients, then for ethnic nationalism, rootedness is the strongest predictor in this whole battery of variables that are in the model, has that largest coefficient after, probably not surprising, citizenship status. So non-citizens are obviously less inclined to say that you're only a true member of the nation if you were born here. For chauvinism, rootedness is only, the coefficient of rootedness is only surpassed in the size, standardized beta size by citizenship status and age. For populism, authoritarianism, it's on par, the effect size, with other well-known predictors of radical right support, such as education. So note that, for example, here, ethnic nationalism, chauvinism, so rootedness is a stronger predictor if you believe in these betas. Some statisticians tell me that you shouldn't, but that's beyond my pay grade to have even an opinion on that. So if you believe in these, the validity of these betas, then it's stronger than education, which is, of course, the most consistent and often focused upon predictor of radical right attitudes. So next, let's look whether grandparents and parents matter equally. And you can see here that they do. It gets a little bit murky with populism. In general, our results for populism are not as clean as they are for the other attitudinal outcomes, and I'd be happy to offer you some conjectures of why that could be the case. And the effect sizes are relatively similar for parents and grandparents. So it's not all about parents, it's not all about grandparents, it's really an additive kind of mechanisms. And so I'm not going to show, I don't want to overwhelm you with tables and stuff, but I'm happy to show them in Q&A if you want to see the details. So descriptively, rooted milieus can be found across the rural-urban divide, actually amazingly equal distribution of the number of ancestors born in a current locale across in both rural places and in urban places, and also across socioeconomic status divides measured by education and by income. But maybe the effects vary, maybe you have interaction effects, maybe the effects of rootedness is stronger in certain milieus than others. Well, no, for the rural-urban divide, and we went at great length to show that. I'm happy to show you all the details about that. So there's no interaction effects. Here, there are interaction effects for social class, both for education and income. And somewhat surprisingly, the effects of rootedness are somewhat more marked, somewhat stronger in among highly educated respondents and among more affluent respondents. But it's a matter of, I'm happy to show you the graphs. It's really a slight increase, so there's nothing dramatic going on, or no reversal of signs or anything like that. And this is the result for support for radical right parties. So this is the result from a logistic regression, less precisely estimated, as you can see. And the effect is relatively small compared to the attitudinal results that we had. It's on par with other kinds of explanatory factors, fear of globalization, and so on, but it's not as powerful as when we have attitudes as the outcome. Okay, so let me get to the difficult business of disentangling milieu from selection effects. So it could, of course, be that individuals select into more or less rooted milieus based on their political attitudes that they form independently of any such milieu effects. Before I do whatever we can with the data that we have, which is not perfect, as you will notice, let me just say two things. One, so a selection mechanism couldn't explain why rooted milieus are radical right-leaning, right? While our theory makes an argument about why these milieus tilt to the radical right and not, for example, to the radical left. While a selection mechanism can only basically point at a reinforcement mechanism, that people would select a milieu that is with which they have a political affinity, but it doesn't explain why there should be a right-leaning milieu. And I'll also note that this distribution of ancestral birthplaces in space is, of course, exogenous to the attitudes of individuals themselves, because they have no control of whether their grandparents are born in the places where their parents are born, and so on and so on. They can only choose between different locales which, with a different number of, with a given number of birthplaces. We are sadly stuck with observational data. There is no, I mean, if we were thinking about doing an online experiment, but it just makes no sense. You know, the external validity problems will be gigantic if you would say to people with a vignette or something, imagine you were a very rooted person. How would you vote? And we were looking for observational data where there's an external shock, where some people were forced to move and others not. So some people became uprooted, and there is a data set that a lot of people are excited about. It's in Iceland, and there was a volcano outbreak, and some people were moving away and others not. But I looked at this in detail, and it's not suitable because there was some complications about that make it not suitable for our purposes. So what we do, we have three strategies to deal with the problem. The first one is propensity score matching. That was kind of hot in sociology, at least for a while. I think it's no longer that hot, but we do it anyway. So there's two steps here. One is to calculate, based on observables, obviously, the probability of individuals to live in a birthplace of ancestors. And then you compare individuals with a similar probability of ending up in rooted milieus, but one of them did, the other one did not end up in such milieus. And then you use this as leverage to calculate a milieu effect net of possible selection. And this is how it looks like. These three estimates are with different definitions of what rooted means. One is with only one ancestor born in the locale. The red is with 2, and the green is with 6, and that's what we find. The limitation here is obviously that we're limited to observables. There might be unobservable things that drive or that explain why people end up in rooted milieus and why they have certain kinds of political attitudes. The second strategy is we do group comparisons, and we choose a group, two groups that have very high likelihood that they have selected into a place. And if selection is the main mechanism, if selection on political attitudes, then the consequence for their observable political attitude should be the opposite. So the first group is root seekers, so individuals who have moved as adults to a place where at least 3 ancestors were born. So they want to be in a place with where 2 parents and at least 1 grandparents, or 2 grandparents, whatever, are currently were born. And then there's root avoiders, people who have moved as adults to a place where none of their ancestors were born. Here, this group sadly also comprises people who might have moved from another place with 0 ancestors to the current place with 0 ancestors. So it's less clear than what the actual selection, in how far selection is involved here. In any case, root seekers should be more radical right-leaning than root avoiders if selection is the main mechanism. If selection on previously independently formed political attitudes is the main mechanism. And this is what we find. We have a much smaller sample here because we do these subgroup analysis, and we find that those who move to rooted places, root seekers, are not different from the root avoiders, although the sign of these coefficients points in the direction of that would support a selection mechanism. The third strategy is we use 2 different groups, and we estimate whether milieu effects can be found even among people who, 2 groups that have different tendencies or would have different tendencies of self-selection based on previous attitudes. So we look at root seekers as before, who should be especially radical right-leaning, and then we look at what we call rooted stayers, people who have never left their birthplace, who live where they have been born, and where at least one ancestor was born there as well. Unfortunately, that's again not perfect because the rooted stayers include people who might have self-selected into that milieu, but it also includes people who might just be stuck in their birthplace, always wanted to get away from Stein am Rhein, but never really were able to do it. So if selection drives attitudes, then the root seekers should be, again, more right-leaning than the rooted stayers. If milieu effects drive attitudes, then the effect of the rootedness should be identical for root seekers and for rooted stayers, no interaction effects. And this is the result. So you can see that rooted stayers and root seekers in this subsample don't differ from each other in their political attitudes, which speaks against, again, selection effects. And there's no interaction effect either, which means that there are uniform milieu effects across groups with different supposed tendency for self-selection based on their previous political attitudes. So that's basically what we did to try to disentangle imperfectly, but I think still suggestive, selection from milieu effects. And then we looked at some confounders, and all our results hold. The magnitude of the coefficient doesn't really move around much. We look at local economic decline, which might get people stuck in place, at least by some interpretation of what that would do to people's mobility, and it would make radical right attitudes more attractive. We do this by using data from the US with county unemployment rates. So this is just one of our 22 countries. Traditionalism may be a more plausible confounder. A traditionalist attitude formed on the basis of whatever other mechanisms might encourage people to stick with their family because family values is part of traditionalism, and it might then make them more inclined to develop radical right attitudes. And here we have the full sample, and we have an item that measures the fear to lose traditions as a measurement of traditionalism. Then we look at downward social mobility, which might, again, make people stuck. Downward social mobility, for those who are not sociologists, is if your social status, education, or income is lower than that of your parents or your grandparents. And we have 2 measurements here, one based on education and one based on occupational prestige rankings, and our results hold up if we include this variable in the equation. Okay, so I don't know, how am I doing time? I think I'm working against time like crazy. Actually, no, I still have a couple of minutes, so. Okay, let's breathe and take a step back also from this, from the empirics, and see what it actually means and what it doesn't mean. So does this argument explain the rise of radical right parties over the last 10 years? The rise of AfD and of the Trump populist, of Meloni, of Le Pen, and so on and so on. And obviously it doesn't. First, because we have a snapshot of data only. We have no longitudinal data. And second, we are also not really, our argument is also not geared towards, doesn't want to explain the ups and downs of the fate of radical right parties. We're more interested in this more slow-moving demand side factor, and much of the recent rise of the radical right might be supply side driven. However, maybe our argument does contribute, but only indirectly and as a conjecture with no direct evidence, given the snapshot nature of our data, does maybe help to understand the recent rise of radical right voting and attitudes around the world. So in many countries, intergenerational geographic mobility has decreased substantially. And there's a whole debate in economic geography and other kinds of disciplines of why that is. And that would, the decrease in mobility would obviously mean, conversely, an increase in rootedness, which, according to our argument, might or does explain radical right attitudes and voting. So this is some support for that conjecture. Just look at this dark line here, and here is the percentage. So this is the percentage of people in the US who have lived in a different county in the previous year. I'm sure that there would be data in Germany for that. I'm sure SOAP has something probably even better than that, but that's what I came across. And you can see that from the 1980s, where it was about 20%, it declined to about 7.5%. So that's quite substantial and important. If we take even a step further back and prolong the time horizon massively over, let's say, 150 years, this is what I usually in other kind of research like to do, so I'm really unhappy about snapshot data, then maybe the massive decrease in rootedness that was brought about by industrialization and urbanization, where people moved away from the places where they grew up, where their ancestors grew up and so on, went to the city, went from Meersburg to Konstanz, and from Steinheim to Zurich. So maybe that helps to explain the rise of the opposite of radical right attitudes in that same time period. The rise of liberal values, of civic nationalist values, the whole massive wave of liberalization that you find in the politics of most countries who underwent industrialization and urbanization. That's, of course, a speculation, but I find it interesting to at least entertain the idea that this argument could also be brought to bear on macro political long-term kind of modernization processes. Okay, the conclusion. So it's a new argument that we bring into this literature, focusing on multi-generational milieus. It's a strong predictor of attitudes, not such a strong predictor of party preferences, and it's largely overlooked by the literature. There's some hints here and there where people talk about family in ethnographic accounts of Tea Party supporters or Le Pen fans in rural France, but it's never really fleshed out, not made into a full argument, let alone, empirically kind of substantiated. And the evidence is that I presented to you is suggestive, definitely not conclusive, but at least it's suggestive that these are milieu effects rather than selection effects. So contrary to a common perception among social scientists and generally progressive individuals, to which most social scientists belong, rootedness and the corresponding attitude it generates is not the exclusive domain of rural and uneducated environments. It's not just them who are the bad guys who live in Stein am Rhein. You also find it in New York, you find it in Los Angeles. Sorry, I'm not familiar enough with the German landscape to give you German examples. In New York, for example, there's Staten Island, which is a working class enclave in the south, very rooted milieu, a deep red dot on the electoral outcome maps every election. In the middle of moving to the opposite side of the socioeconomic scale in Newport Beach, in Orange County, in Southern California, so close to Los Angeles, you have a very wealthy, deep red enclave of people who have been living there for a very long time. Our argument goes beyond the usual focus on the West, and I didn't have time to show you that, but it works very well for our non-Western countries as well, with some exceptions, India, and so on and so on. And I think if one wants to pursue this milieu argument a little bit further, one would obviously have to look at other milieus as well. We don't argue this is the only milieu. One could look at tech bras as a micro milieu within which radical right attitudes have emerged recently. One could look at country clubs, golf clubs, and things like that. So I think there's probably, if one had the resources and the time and the energy to pursue this agenda more broadly, one would end up with a lot of equifinality. One would find multiple milieus that have, within which radical right attitudes appear to be plausible and morally justified. Thank you.